Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on the furniture foam testing project at Duke University. First, I want to thank you all for your participation in the study and your interest in our research here at Duke at the Superfund Research Center. For the last 2.5 years, the faculty and staff from the Superfund Research Center's Analytical Chemistry Core have evaluated samples of polyurethane foam from over 900 households across the United States. Staff from the Superfund Center's Research Translation Core then responded to each of those participants, helping them understand the results. Dr. Heather Stapleton and Dr. Ellen Cooper have led this work from the Analytical Chemistry Core, and they're here today to share more about their findings and respond to some of the questions we received from you, our participants. Dr. Heather Stapleton received her PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park, and she has spent the last 10 years conducting research on the use of flame retardants in consumer products. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, the Chicago Tribune, Scientific American, and Time Magazine, to name a few. And in 2012, she testified in a Senate hearing on the health hazards of flame retardant chemicals. In general, her research focuses on understanding how organic contaminants move and disperse in indoor environments and evaluating exposure to these chemicals in people, particularly children. Dr. Ellen Cooper received her PhD from Duke University and worked on a dissertation research project related to environmental remediation of sulfur-containing PAHs. She then worked as a postdoctoral associate with Dr. Stapleton until 2011. She currently manages the Superfund Center's Analytical Chemistry Core and is a critical part of the Duke Foam Project. Dr. Cooper's primary research interests include analyzing environmentally important organic chemicals that are found in water, sediment, biological samples, and of course in polyurethane foam. Before we start, a few administrative details about our webinar today. Dr. Stapleton and Dr. Cooper will present to you for about half an hour, 45 minutes, and then we will open the webinar to questions. Some of you have already sent in some great questions for our Foam Questions email address, and we've prepared responses to them. We will share our responses to some of those questions in the second half of the webinar. If you have a question during the webinar, please press the chat button in WebEx and select Question Moderator from the drop-down menu where it says Send To. We'll try and share as many of those as we can with Dr. Stapleton for her to address in the second half of the webinar. For those questions we're not able to address during the webinar, we'll try to respond to your inquiries by email as soon as we are able, and we will be posting the recorded webinar on the same page where we posted the registration link for the webinar. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stapleton and Dr. Cooper. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Just quickly before we begin, I might ask all participants online if they could to mute their audio so that there are not background noises among the other participants, and we'll try to assist with that here. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for participating in this webinar. I first also want to start by saying thank you to all of you who submitted samples for testing. Prior to initiating this project, we had very little information on the use of these chemicals in consumer products. And several agencies have been trying to conduct risk assessments for several of the flame retardant chemicals we'll be discussing today, but those assessments have been hampered by lack of data on use and potential exposure. We simply don't know where some of these chemicals are used and where they're not used. But thanks to all of you, we now have more insight and fortunately enough data on more than 1,500 samples analyzed to date. I think this project really demonstrates the power of community engagement and citizen science, so thank you very much. We really appreciate your involvement. With that, I'm going to start. Hopefully everyone can see the title slide on the screen. I'm going to move to the slide 2 now and just advance so hopefully everyone can follow along. So here's a list of the agenda. Today you're going to hear from myself and Dr. Ellen Cooper, who runs this foam testing program. During the presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the use of flame retardants in furniture, discuss briefly the standard that really led to the use of these chemicals in residential furniture in particular, describe the motivation for this project, and then turn it over to Dr. Cooper, who will give you an overview of the project and how sample submissions are run, how we analyze these samples, and just discuss some of the data collected to date. And then I'll end by discussing some of the exposure issues and potential health concerns for some of these chemicals, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I do have a few questions that we have received that I'll address at the end of this presentation, but again, we'll open it up to questions during the last 15 or 20 minutes. All right, so we're here to talk about flame retardant chemicals in consumer products. And we started this research primarily looking at the use of these chemicals in residential furniture. And so we've often received the question, why are these chemicals in residential furniture? Well, that's really due to a California flammability standard, often referred to as Technical Bulletin 117. Due to concerns about fire, and particularly furniture containing polyurethane foam being an ignition source, the state implemented this standard in 1972. Many manufacturers, large manufacturers, don't like to have two different production lines, so they often produce furniture to meet this California standard. When it was first implemented in 1972, this standard required that the filling material on the cushions was stand a 12-second open flame standard. Industry often responded to this standard by adding chemical flame retardants to the polyurethane foam to meet this open flame test. And that's really led to the use of high volumes of these chemicals in residential furniture. At the bottom of the slide, you can see a picture of the old hang tag for Technical Bulletin 117. Now, the standard has changed recently, and I'll address that shortly. A lot of research has focused on this class of chemicals, really due to some observations in the scientific literature where polybromine and diphenyl ethers were observed in a variety of different samples. This is an additive flame retardant mixture applied to polyurethane foam and furniture, and it's been estimated that 98% of the world market demand for Penta was used to meet California TB 117. Studies have demonstrated that PBDs do accumulate in human tissues. They've been detected in both abiotic and abiotic environments, and several studies demonstrated that the concentrations of these PBDEs, both in human tissues and in wildlife, were increasing, particularly through the 1990s into the early 2000s. Due to concerns about their persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity potential, there is a ban on the use of these chemicals in the European Union in 2002 and a voluntary phase-out in the U.S. starting in 2005. With that phase-out, there are a lot of questions regarding what chemicals would be used as the replacements, particularly in residential furniture, and not much information was available. To address this data gap, our research laboratory focused on the analysis of some consumer products, particularly baby products and residential sofas, to understand which chemicals were being used to meet TB 117. So these studies were published in 2011 and 2012. And in those studies, we found that the more common flame retardants added to polyurethane foam were, as we expected, penta-BDE, and those were primarily in older samples. And then we observed a series of organophosphate flame retardants. And I'm not going to go into too much of the chemistry, and I use their acronyms here. So there are some chlorinated organophosphates and some non-halogenated organophosphates, which we refer to TDCPP being one of the more prevalent flame retardants we find in consumer products. There's a mixture called Firemaster 550 that contains both brominated flame retardants and organophosphate flame retardants, and we'll discuss those, and several others that we refer to as TPP and TCPP. And I have some more data on these towards the end of this webinar. However, as I said, there's been a few changes over the past few years. TDCPP was added to California Proposition 65 list around 2013. This is a list that the state of California maintains containing a list of chemicals that are either suspected reproductive toxicants or considered carcinogens, and the addition of TDCPP to that list raised lots of questions on how often it would be used in furniture moving forward. In addition, the state of California, due to concerns about the bioaccumulation and persistence and toxicity of several of these flame retardants, amended that standard. So they moved, in 2013, they moved from an open flame to a smolder standard to more accurately address fires that were started by smoldering sources like a smoldering cigarette. They also amended the standard to require a hang tag or a label on the product indicating whether or not the product contains flame retardants. So you can see a picture on the right here of this new TB 117 label where it indicates whether the product does or does not contain flame retardants. One additional change was that the standard also applies now to the product, the final product, and not just the filling material. So all these changes raised a lot of questions about how this would also influence the use of these chemicals in, particularly in furniture, but also other products that contain polyurethane foam. As these questions were raised, we were also receiving a lot of questions from just the general public and even some industry members about the use of these chemicals in polyurethane foam. And because of the overwhelming response to these publications, we actually approached the Superfund Research Center to see if they would be interested in funding this research so that we can make a testing service available to the general public. Therefore, if someone wanted to know if one of these chemicals was present in their sofa or their mattress, they could send us a sample and we would test it and return some information to them. So we launched this service in early 2014, and on the screen you can see the website and the link for the website on the bottom. And what I'm going to do now is actually turn it over to Dr. Ellen Cooper, who runs this program, and she's going to tell you more about the submission process and the data we've collected to date. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Cooper.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining in. Dr. Cooper. So as Heather just said, we started this service in February 2014, and since that time we received quite an outpouring from the public. So you've probably already been to the web page that I'm showing here, where you can learn a little bit more about the project. You can find out about flame retardants and foam in general, get some information about reducing exposure, and also submit a sample if you haven't already done so. We accept 5 samples per household, and we only accept at this point in time polyurethane foam samples. It gives you information about how to collect a sample, and also collects information from you regarding your sample. And the type of information that we collect include the type of product the puff is from, the year it was purchased, the state of purchase, whether or not it contains a TB117 label, and if so, what version of that label, and the manufacturing company, or country, sorry. Since we started the program, we've received more than 1,500 samples, which is quite a lot of samples. Just to give you an idea of what happens when we get your sample, we cut a small piece of foam, an entire process. We minimize contamination by wearing gloves and maintaining a clean workspace, rinsing all of our equipment between samples with solvent. We weigh about 0.05 grams of the foam into a glass test tube. We use glass because most of these compounds stick to plastic. We add 5 mils of a solvent, dichloromethane. We then sonicate the sample in an ultrasonic bath for 15 minutes. These flame retardants are actually just added to the foam. They're not incorporated into the foam structure, so they come out fairly easily. We dilute the sample 10 times to 1 mil. We have to do this because they're usually added to foam at very high levels that overwhelm our instrument. We then run it on a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer and then identify the flame retardants using authentic standards and comparing to a in-house made spectral library. We enter the information into a database and then turn things over to Brian for reporting. So the next couple slides, I'm just going to give you a little bit more detail about the actual compounds that we screen for. Heather gave you a few of these names up at the front. On the left-hand column is the chemical name. The middle column is the structure, and then on the right are the mixes that we call them by, or if we have available, the product trade name. So in general, we have a class of non-halogenated organophosphates here, present in products Firemaster 550, Firemaster 600, penta-BDE, mixes TDCPP and MPP. The bromodiphenyl ethers here, common in penta-BDE mixture. A class of chlorinated organophosphates, TDCPP, TCPP, and a few others. And then alternative brominated flame retardants that we call TBB, they get a little confusing. It's alphabet soup. TBPH, present in Firemaster 550 and 600. I want to draw your attention to a paper we recently published just last month on the findings from this study to date. The publication DOI is present down here. I'm going to present some of the findings from this paper, but if you would like more detail, you can certainly find this paper online. At the time of the publication, we were reporting on 1,141 samples we received, and just a little over half of these samples contained a flame retardant detected in our screening process. Most of these samples, 451 of these samples, were sofas and love seats, followed by chairs, mattress pads, child car seats, mattresses, and then a suite of other products. These pies just kind of give you a breakdown of the types of flame retardants we observed in these products. All samples are in this upper leftmost pie, and then I've just given you the main product primary product categories: child car seats, mattresses, and other child products on the top, sofas, love seats, chairs, rocking chairs, recliners, and mattress pads across the bottom. The most frequently detected flame retardant in all product categories was this maroon pie wedge, TDCPP. Now, the frequency of detection, it was the most frequently detected flame retardant, but the actual portion of products in any given product category varies depending on the product type. So, for instance, this pie wedge is quite large for child car seats, mattress pads quite small. The green pie wedge is non-detect, so no flame retardant detected in our screening process, and it varies too with product type. So again, just comparing child car seats is a very small wedge compared to the mattress pads, a very large wedge. A great portion of the mattress pads do not contain flame retardants. The second most frequently detected flame retardant varies by category, is either Firemaster 550 or TCPP. So looking across time, we collected enough samples that we could do a little investigation in flame retardant detection across time, just in sofas and love seats, rocking chairs and recliners and chairs, mattress pads, and child car seats, and just looking at whether or not the product contained a flame retardant or didn't. And we binned it out based on some year breaks, kind of trying to match those changes in regulations, remembering that the Penta phase-out was in 2005, and then a couple of changes in Prop 65 and the TV117 labeling occurring between 2011 and 2013. So kind of, it's not a consistent trend across all products, but we observed that from 1950 into somewhere in the mid-2000s, we see an increase in flame retardant usage, especially in the furniture, sofas, rocking chairs, recliners. Then after 2014, we see a decrease in flame retardant usage in sofas and love seats, rocking chairs and recliners and chairs, and especially child car seats. We sort of see this trend again in mattress pads, but it's very mild. We're not sure it's very significant at this time. So let's take a closer look at sofas and love seats before and after 2005. Remember, the Penta phase-out is in 2005. And let's look specifically at the type of flame retardant used. So percent of products containing a flame retardant: blue before 2005, red purchased after 2005. And we see that use of Penta BDE very much decreased in products purchased after 2005. But TCIPP, TBPP, and Firemaster 550 all increased, suggesting these are being used as a replacement. Specifically, this compound here, TCIPP, also known as TCPP, not used or not observed before 2005. Okay, let's look at the products purchased before and after 2014. And again, thinking that we saw a lot of changes in Prop 65, TDCPP added to Prop 65 in 2011, and then changes in the TV117 labeling and flammability standards around 2013. So products we purchased before and after 2014, sofas and love seats that fall under TV117, and child car seats that fall under a different flammability standard entirely. So between 2000 and 2014, 70% of sofas and love seats were treated with flame retardants, and after 2014, less than 40%. We observed that use of flame retardant use varies with the product type. We saw that TDCPP use decreases after 2014 in sofas and love seats, and also in child car seats. We saw that TCIPP use seems to increase after 2014 in both products here. TBPP use seems to increase in sofas and love seats after 2014, but we don't see it used at all in child car seats. And we don't really see any change, regardless of the product, in Firemaster 550 use. So this change in TDCPP use might reflect addition to Prop 65. It could also reflect addition to the labeling. We just can't tell at this time. So just running down some of the a summary of these results: Penta BDE use and thus the exposure has significantly decreased since 2005. but alternative flame retardant use has increased. The use of TDCPP appears to be decreasing since 2014, which coincides with its addition to Prop 65 list. Over the last 2 years, the increased detection of TCIPP and other organophosphate mixtures have been observed, but studies on the health effects of these new flame retardants are limited or lacking. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Heather.
Thank you, Ellen, for the very nice overview of our foam screening project. What I was going to do now is just kind of provide a little more detail on what is known about toxicity or hazards associated with the flame retardants that we detect more frequently. So I particularly wanted to focus in on TDCPP, TCPP, and Firemaster 550. As I mentioned before, TDCPP has been added to California Prop 65, so we do expect its use is likely to change, and we have observed that in the foam testing study, as Ellen just described to you, that demonstrating that furniture purchased more recently, particularly in the last year or two, there's a much lower prevalence of this compound being used. But there's been a lot of attention on TDCPP even over this past several decades, and that's because it was identified as a flame retardant in children's pajamas back in the 1970s. However, researchers at the University of California, Berkeley found that children wearing these pajamas and its brominated analog could absorb them, and the metabolites would be detected in urine. Furthermore, an in vitro test suggested that TDCPP and its brominated analog were mutagenic and likely to cause cancer. So there's been more research on this chemical in particular. Now, it is important to note that the types of flame retardants I'm describing to you today are not used in children's pajamas today. I know that is a question we receive quite frequently. There are different technologies used to make children's pajamas and sleepwear flame resistant, which do not require these types of additive flame retardant chemicals. That's important to note. But regarding TDCPP, studies conducted by the National Toxicology Program over a 2-year carcinogenicity assay found that rats chronically exposed over those 2 years did accumulate a greater number of tumors. It was statistically significant in several different tissues. Thus, it is considered a probable human carcinogen. And actually, more research has been done on TDCPP just over the last several years, and several studies have found that chronic exposure in both rats and fish also leads to significant changes in thyroid hormone levels and thyroid regulation. Now, PBDEs were also known to have a similar effect in animal studies, and PBDEs have a chemical structure that's very similar to thyroid hormones, so there's been a lot of research in that area. However, TDCPP does have a very different structure. It's not likely to mimic a thyroid hormone, and it's not quite clear what the mechanism is, but there are more studies ongoing to understand why TDCPP does affect thyroid hormone regulation. Now, our laboratory has been conducting biomonitoring for several of these flame retardant chemicals, and we've developed methods. The biomonitoring approach really depends on the type of flame retardant. PBDEs have very long half-lives in the body, and we measure exposure and biomonitoring using blood samples. However, with these organophosphates, they are metabolized more quickly in the body, and so to conduct biomonitoring for the organophosphates, we collect urine and analyze the urine for the urinary metabolites. So we have been analyzing urine samples collected from the general public in the United States, both adults and children, over the past couple of years, and we see very high detection of this compound in most samples. More than 90% of the population has these metabolites present in their urine. And we also know that exposure is higher in children relative to adults. So we've seen this in 2 different studies now, where if you look at mother and children in the same household, the children have higher levels of exposure. We also recently published a study, the Hoffman et al. Paper, where we analyzed urine collected from infants and found that infants actually have higher levels than toddlers. And we hypothesize that this may be due to the fact that there are a number of baby products that contain polyurethane foam that are also treated with TDCPP that might be a source of exposure, but certainly this needs more research. If we move on to TCPP, as Ellen said, I know these acronyms get very confusing. This is a chlorinated organophosphate, very similar to TDCPP. It's actually very similar in structure, with the exception that each arm off of that oxygen ester lacks a chlorine that's present in TDCPP. So the lack of one chlorine in each ester arm is the difference in the chemical structures. It has not been tested the same way for carcinogenicity as TDCPP has. However, the National Toxicology Program is currently conducting a chronic rodent assay to determine whether or not rats exposed to this chemical also accumulate tumors. There have been some reports from other types of research studies with animals, though. For example, in zebrafish, TCPP was not as acutely toxic as TDCPP, suggesting it has a lower hazard profile, and we observed no impacts on neurobehavioral assessments. However, a study published in 2013 by Farhart et al. Did find that exposure in chicken embryos resulted in delayed development and disruption of thyroid endpoints, very similar to effects observed for TDCPP. So again, there may be this suggestion that the chlorinated organophosphates also are endocrine disruptors, but again, more research is needed. Now, we have developed, working with some colleagues actually over at the University of Antwerp, developed some methods to monitor the urinary metabolites for TCPP as well. And we just recently published a study where we report on the urinary levels for this the metabolite of TCPP, and again, moms and the toddlers living in the same home. This actually was also detected in 100% of the samples that we analyzed in our laboratory. In this case, the levels weren't, they were pretty similar between the mom and the children, but correlated. So we do think it's exposure in the home environment. Moving on to Firemaster 550, this is a commercial mixture that was introduced to the market around 2000-2002 and marketed primarily as a replacement for penta-BDE in polyurethane foam and furniture. As I mentioned before, it's a mixture of both brominated flame retardants and organophosphate flame retardants, and you can see the structures of 4 primary components on the right. 2 of them are organophosphate in nature and 2 are brominated. This is probably the second or third most common flame retardant we detect in products right now. And we have been conducting some biomonitoring for the metabolites of the organophosphates and for the urinary metabolite of TBB. These are also less persistent compared to PBDEs, so we track their exposure and conduct biomonitoring by using urine samples. However, I do want to point out that detection in the urine sample does not necessarily suggest exposure to Firemaster 550 because some of these components are also used in other commercial mixtures. In particular, some of these organophosphates are also used as plasticizers, so we can't rule out exposure from other sources. However, there have been a number of animal laboratory studies conducted using these components in the laboratory, and studies have found that some of these components are adipogenic, meaning that a few of these chemicals can bind to certain receptors within cells and stimulate pathways that lead to triglyceride accumulation, and that's been shown in particular for some of the organophosphates. Some of them are considered endocrine disruptors for interacting with several different receptors that regulate hormone levels in the body. And then there's some concerns that some of these, particularly the organophosphates, may be neural and developmentally toxic. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But it is important to note that these chemicals actually have been prioritized for risk assessment by the EPA. And so I think more focus will be paid to these chemicals moving forward. Now, last year there was a study published. This was research conducted by the National Toxicology Program, where they were evaluating the developmental and neurotoxic profiles for some of these new flame retardants and comparing them to some of these what we call legacy flame retardants, particularly BDE47, which is present in that penta-BDE mixture. Several of the organophosphate flame retardants that are found in Firemaster 550, like the 2 I just showed you on the previous slide, and one of the organophosphates present in the mixture that we refer to as TBPP, stands for tert-butyl-phenyl phosphate, were found in the study to be equally or more toxic than BD47 in a few of these assays. They did rank the relative potency of these flame retardants based on their observations, which was limited to certain assays both in vitro and in vivo, meaning either with cells or in animal studies that related to developmental toxicity or developmental neurotoxicity and acute toxicity. And I just highlighted 2 of these observations from this publication. One is that the TPP, ITP, and BPDP, again, I know these acronyms are hard, they displayed greater overt toxicity in zebrafish compared to BDE47, and ITP and BPDP displayed greater impacts on neuronal firing rates. So in rat neuronal cells in culture, the exposure to these chemicals affected the rate at which these neurons communicated to one another, suggesting they could have acute or neurotoxic impacts. And so those were greater than BDE47. Right, so there are impacts of these chemicals that have been observed in studies, but it's important to note that this is sometimes difficult to relate to exposure in the human population. So let's just talk a little bit about how we can reduce exposure. I know this is a question we receive quite frequently. As I said before, 90 to 100% of the population, depending on the analyte, contain these chemicals in our bodies. Generally, levels are higher in children, but there are ways or steps that one can take to reduce exposure. If you find out that one of these flame retardants is present in your sofa or one of the larger pieces of furniture, certainly removing it, if economically feasible, is an option to reduce the levels in the home environment. However, just recognize that they will still be present in the indoor environment for some time, and it can take several months before the levels are completely eliminated once you remove the source. We've also been conducting surveys to understand how often washing one's hands can relate to body burdens. And we have found that people that wash their hands more frequently generally will have lower levels of these chemicals in their body, which suggests to us that washing hands frequently, and particularly before you eat, can reduce exposure. We do detect these chemicals on our hands, which might just be because they're in the air, or it could be we have contact, physical contact, in touching some of these products, which results in exposure. You can also vacuum and clean the home more frequently, although you want to avoid stirring up a lot of dust particles, because that could just increase exposure, but maybe using wet mopping approaches, or et cetera, can reduce the levels in the home. We often receive questions about the use of air purifiers in the home. Most air purifiers work by removing particles from the air. Some chemicals will be present on those particles, but sometimes they're not present on particles in large fractions, so it can help reduce some exposure, but not all, and it really depends on the type of flame retardant. And I want to direct you to our website again, because we do have a link up on the web page that provides more information on reducing exposure. Just to follow up about some next steps with this program, we will continue to analyze polyurethane foam and accept submissions for flame retardants for at least another year with our current funding. After another year, we'll have to determine if we have enough funding to support this program. As Ellen said, we're currently screening foam for the presence or absence of those 7 primary flame retardants. I just want to point out again, that means that the chemical is present. If we say it's present or detected, it means it's present at a concentration greater than 1% by weight. However, given the changes in the standards, we're also interested in knowing whether there might be applications of these flame retardants, but at a lower rate. So moving forward, we also will probably be screening both at 1% by weight and 0.1% by weight, just to understand the impacts of changes in the standards even further. We will also consider analyzing textiles in future studies. This is something we're trying to develop with our methods. We're not ready to accept them yet, but this is something we're interested in exploring, because we do know that some of these same flame retardants used in polyurethane foam are also used in textiles. And there's also a lack of information on the application of these chemicals to upholstery and furniture. Sometimes these chemicals are used on the back coating of textiles in furniture, and we don't have a lot of information on that use as well. And then moving forward, we're trying to conduct some research to understand the links between use of specific products and exposure levels. Which products contribute most to our exposure on average in the general population? Is it the use of these chemicals in sofas? They're also used in wirings and cables and insulation. Some flame retardants are used in the enclosures of TVs. Right now we know they're detected in the home, they're in the air, they're in dust. And we know in particular that levels in dust can predict levels in the body. But we don't know exactly which products in the home contribute to those levels in dust, and that's still a big question mark. So moving forward, we are in the process of conducting additional studies to better inform ourselves or inform the research about links between specific product use and exposure. So I wanted just to address, we'll start opening up for questions soon. We wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. I've listed here 4 questions that we've received to date, and these are questions we also receive frequently, and I wanted to address these right off the bat. Question number 1 being, where can I have my blood tested for flame retardants? Well, as I said before, there's at least 7 flame retardants that we screen for in our project. PBDEs are really the only flame retardants that are routinely measured in blood. And to my knowledge, there are unfortunately not a lot of laboratories, contract laboratories, available where you can submit a sample for testing. We have directed people to 1 or 2 in the past, but this can be very expensive. Some laboratories can charge up to $1,000 a sample to measure PBDEs in blood, and that's because it's very complicated and very challenging. So it is possible, but most research conducted on levels in blood are usually conducted through academic universities or research studies where people have to be consented in. So it's a very challenging process. Now, the organophosphates, as I said before, those are measured by looking for the urinary metabolites. And so there we're testing urine. This is something we do in our lab, but again, it's usually under the umbrella of a larger research study where we have to consent people in. So again, I'm not aware of a lot of contract laboratories that are available for testing urine samples for the metabolites or the organophosphates. And as I said before, you could have them tested, but don't be surprised if they come back positive. As I said before, almost all people have these chemicals in our body. What we're trying to do is just conduct research to understand whether higher exposure to these chemicals is associated with any adverse health outcomes, and that's where the field really needs to go and to move towards. These studies are underway for several of these flame retardants. It's just these studies take time. Epidemiology studies can take several years before the data is available just due to the nature of the studies. So for example, PBDEs were phased out in 2005, and there's still studies just coming out now providing more insight into the potential adverse health outcomes of PBDEs. And it'll probably be a couple of years before we understand if there are any adverse outcomes associated with exposure to organophosphates. So the second question, can you tell me which manufacturers are still using flame retardants in your furniture? This is a very difficult question to ask. This is also one we receive frequently. We do ask for information on the survey form about which manufacturer produced that product. Usually it's on a label or a tag on the product that's being tested. We keep that in our database. However, we are not able to release that information to the public for several reasons. The primary reason being that we don't have a chain of custody on the foam sample. Someone submits a foam sample and they tell us it was purchased and manufactured by company A, but we have no way of verifying that information because all we're receiving is a piece of foam. So that makes it a little more difficult, and for legal reasons, then we don't release any information on what we've observed relative to specific manufacturers. In addition, we've collected information in the past that suggests to us that the use of these chemicals can change within a manufacturer from year to year. So there's a lot of variables that go into this. So it's not really a straightforward story to identify use by a manufacturer. So for those reasons, we don't return information on manufacturer use of flame retardants. Question 3, which flame retardant is most toxic? This is also very challenging, right, because toxicity and hazard profiles are not available for all endpoints for all flame retardants. And some of this can depend on which endpoint is of most interest. So there's concerns for carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicity, development or neurotoxicity. We have some data available on some of those points for some chemicals, but not a very robust, rich data set to evaluate all of those endpoints for all of the flame retardants. So again, it becomes very challenging. There are some attempts to categorize relative potency for these different chemicals, depending on which endpoint is the chemical has most efficacious or potent effect on a specific endpoint. But those studies are still underway, and it's very difficult to relate that. So that's a very difficult question to answer, and we can't really provide information on what is the most toxic chemical. Question number 4, where can I purchase furniture without flame retardants? Again, this kind of gets back to the manufacturer's question, and we can't always answer this. However, there are some distributors, companies that advertise on their website that they don't use flame retardants, so I'd encourage folks to check with the manufacturers. In addition, I think I mentioned that the new standard, the California standard, actually requires a hand tag or a label on the product indicating whether or not that product does or does not contain flame retardants. It'll say yes or no. So I encourage everyone to look for that label, and that will provide them information. Now, that only pertains to products that are considered residential furniture, so it will not pertain to mattresses, for example. We do get a lot of questions about mattresses in general, and that's also really depends on the type of mattress. We have observed flame retardants in children's mattresses, particularly small mattresses made of 100% polyurethane foam. These are typically the more of the inexpensive mattresses that you might see in, for example, a daycare center or used as a nap mat. Those often do contain flame retardants. We have a little bit of information on that. But then if you move to the higher end mattresses that you'll see in cribs that contain different layers of materials with springs and cotton and polyester filling, those typically do not contain flame retardants. And in most adult mattresses do not contain flame retardants as well. They do meet a federal flammability standard. However, the approach to meeting that standard is usually by using barrier materials or other technologies without using chemical flame retardants. However, with that being said, as you might have observed from our data, we have identified flame retardants in some mattresses. Those mattresses tend to be mattresses that are all foam. Some have been foam that are more like memory foam. So there might be some use of flame retardants in certain sectors, but in general, most mattresses do not contain a large number of flame retardants. So those are some of the main questions that we received. Just want to acknowledge a few people, and then we're going to open it up for questions on the web. Really want to thank, this has been a large team effort among all the Superfund groups here at Duke University, between the Research Translation Core and the Analytical Chemistry Core. And I certainly want to thank our collaborators, Lee Ferguson and Dr. Clark in particular, and all of our research technicians that have helped analyze samples, communicate with the participants, and help with the reporting on the data that we have collected. And again, thank you to all the participants, because this really wouldn't be possible without an interest from the public. And so I think this has really generated a lot of very useful data, and we hope to continue it. So we'll see how that goes in the future. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to open it up for some questions that may have come in over the web. Have we received a few? Yes, okay.
We have one from Neil Cohen, who asked, when did EPA prioritize the risk assessments for the Firemaster chemical before or after the new TSCA regulations?
Yes. Could you hear the question? I think there's a question asking when EPA prioritized the Firemaster 550 component before or after the new TSCA legislation. That was prioritized before TSCA. And my understanding is that the EPA is currently working on a draft list that will reflect the new TSCA legislation, which will be released, I think, in a few months later this year. Many anticipate that the flame retardants, at least some of these flame retardants, will be on that list, but it is not yet known.
Okay, we have another question from Marion Heyman, who asked, have you looked at flame retardants in spray polyurethane foam insulation? It would be interesting to see if that contributes to levels in household dust.
Sorry. For anyone who didn't hear the question was whether or not we have looked for flame retardants in spray foam insulation. We have actually looked for flame retardants, not in a really large sample size. I believe it was around 6 to 8 samples of the spray foam. This includes a can of spray foam you could buy at a home improvement store and a few samples from industry. We have detected flame retardants, and I think in all of those we actually detected trischloropropylphosphate, or TCPP, which is one of the flame retardants we detect in foam in this study. It is heavily used in the insulation area, and TCPP is actually commonly detected in indoor dust and indoor air. This is one of the questions we're hoping to answer moving forward to really understand, is that exposure or the presence of that chemical in the home environment due more to its use in furniture, polyurethane foam, or to its use in insulation? And that is an ongoing research study that we do hope to address in the future, but yes, it is present in insulation.
Okay, another question. Have you observed that some countries of origin have lower levels of flame retardants in their products?
Okay, the question was, have we observed whether some products from different countries of origin have different flame retardant chemicals or
lower levels in general?
So we haven't really been tracking that very well, and I think that would be very difficult. There's only really 2 or 3 countries from which the products are made, and we don't see enough variation to really report on that. So I don't think we can really answer that question with the data we have available. I'm sorry.
Okay, and what methods are used to manage products containing flame retardants at the end of their useful lives?
All right, yes, the question relates to end of use. So it depends on the product. I know there's a large focus on end of use issues with sofas and chairs, for example. There are some movements I know in the state of California where there's some options available to swap out the foam to install new foam that's not treated with flame retardants. And then the person to contact for that program would be Arlene Bloom at the Green Science Policy Institute. And I haven't spoken to her recently, but I know she was trying to consider several options about what to do with those flame retardant treated foam once they were swapped out. And I know some foam is used to make and recycled to make bonded carpet padding. However, there are certain regulations that restrict the levels of at least penta-BDE in those products to less than 0.1% by weight, but may not reflect some of the other flame retardants. So there is some recycling going on for carpet padding, but in terms of regulations for other end products, I am not familiar with any. Ellen, are you familiar with any other end products? I don't think so. There. I think this is an ongoing issue that a lot of people are concerned about, and so several agencies are trying to think about best practices or best ways to remove those products without throwing them in a landfill where they might be either sitting there for a long time concentrating or emitting to surrounding environments. Yes. Next question.
So can you describe some of the process of endocrine disruption that occurs from flame retardants?
I'll do my best. I'm really more of a chemist than a toxicologist. As I said before, it really depends on the type of flame retardant. So starting with penta-BDE or PBDEs, as I mentioned before, they have a chemical structure that's very similar to endogenous thyroid hormones that circulate in our body. And several studies have shown that they can actually bind with different proteins in our body that would normally bind a thyroid hormone. So animal studies, for example, have shown that exposure leads to reduced levels of circulating thyroid hormones in the bloodstream. It can upregulate enzymes in the liver that help clear and metabolize those enzymes. It can affect the activity of enzymes in our brain that also regulate thyroid hormones, which are important in neural development, particularly of young individuals. And then the PBDEs are also known to have some interactions with the androgen and estrogen receptor, but I'm not as familiar with those studies, so I don't know that I should really speak to them in too much detail. However, epidemiology studies, there is one epidemiology study that found that higher exposure to PBDEs during pregnancy was related to a longer time to become pregnant. So there's some concerns that exposure might also be related to certain reproductive endpoints. And as I said earlier, the TDCPP and TCPP, these are both kind of considered chlorinated tris. Several recent studies have found that exposure in both fish and rats also leads to reductions in the circulating levels of thyroid hormones, which was an interesting observation. These do not have a chemical structure similar to thyroid hormones, so it's really unclear what the mechanism is. Studies have shown that, like PBDEs, there's an increase in the activity of enzymes in our liver that help clear these thyroid hormones. So that could be a possible mechanism that they might be just upregulating classes of enzymes in our liver. And so then it's unclear what the fuller impact of that increased enzyme activity would be on physiological processes. But more research is underway. And there have been some more recent studies also using what we call in vitro approaches, where you can keep cells in kind of a laboratory dish, and they've shown that some of these chlorinated tris compounds can also affect the way that iodine is taken up into the thyroid gland and the production of the thyroid hormone in the thyroid gland. So there's some concern it could be acting in several different points. So that's the chlorinated tris compounds. And then there's Firemaster 550. And components of that mixture have been shown to bind to a nuclear receptor called PPAR gamma, which is a nuclear receptor that influences lipid metabolism. And studies have shown that if you, what we call agonize or bind to that receptor and increase activity in animals during fetal development, it's possible that change or that effect could lead to changes in metabolism later in life. So, for example, there's concerns that if you disrupt that nuclear receptor earlier in life, there may be a greater chance for type 2 diabetes later in life, or effects related to obesity, not suggesting that it causes obesity in the U.S. population. We know diet and exercise are also big variables there, but it could exacerbate the situation, making it more easy for these adipocytes to grow, to accumulate more weight, or making it more difficult to lose weight. And so there's a big area of research focused on these chemicals, these organophosphates, the non-halogen organophosphates, and how they bind to these nuclear receptors that control lipid metabolism. And so there'll probably be more research on that in the future as well. And there are some research looking at binding to estrogen receptors as well in a few groups. But I don't think those studies are out yet. So that was a long-winded answer. Probably addresses the point. Do we have another question?
We do. We have a few more. What are some of the limitations in testing textiles as part of this project?
Certainly, that's a good question. As I said, we are interested in testing textiles moving forward. The problem with testing textiles compared to polyurethane foam is that textiles includes a lot of different materials. You could have leather, you could have rayon, you could have polyester, whereas in polyurethane foam, we're only testing polyurethane foam. So we can validate our methods using a specific material and make sure that we can effectively and accurately extract the flame retardants and measure them with a good deal of precision and accuracy when it's one material. When you move to textiles, you have a variety of different materials, and so it will be important for us to test our methods with all these different materials that textiles can be comprised of. And so that would take some time, and it also would take some time for us to expand our database, our library database. As I said, some of these flame retardants used in polyurethane foam are used in textiles, and we know that. So for example, TCPP, we have observed recently in upholstery fabric that was going to be used on a furniture piece. We've also detected hexabromocyclododecane and tetrabromobisphenol A in the textiles used on car seats. So that requires making sure that our methods work with these different types of flame retardants and our same extraction method. And we have done some work recently testing textiles used in camping equipment, primarily camping tents. And we did publish a paper on that earlier this year. Interestingly enough, we tested, I think, 5 brands of 2-person backpacking tents. And actually the most common flame retardants we detected in the camping textiles were actually very similar to what we saw in the polyurethane foam. We observed TDCPP as the most common and most abundant flame retardant in the camping textiles, primarily in the floor or the base of the camping tent. And we also observed use of triphenyl phosphate and actually trischloroethyl phosphate, which is not one we included in this list. It is considered also a carcinogen, so it's not used that often, but we have seen it as an impurity in several other flame retardant formulations, such as V6. So we're trying to collect more information on newer flame retardants that might contain TCEP as an impurity, and that research is ongoing. So the primary answer to your question is that there's a lot of different types of textiles, and we need more time to validate our methods and the variety of different materials. So, sorry, another one question again.
Yes, we have about 6 more minutes, but we'll keep going. Okay. Is there a way to follow up with participants and create a pilot study for follow-up? Someone asked.
Yeah, actually we've been discussing that quite a bit lately, and we are interested in following up with participants to understand how the results that they gleaned from this study, how maybe it impacted some of the decisions they made moving forward. And we are actually, I think, in the process of trying to finalize that approach and method, and we actually hope to reach out to participants very shortly, hopefully in the next couple of months to start that. So thank you for asking that. It was well-timed. Another question?
Does the foam testing program extend to samples from countries outside the U.S.?
Yes. Does the foam testing project relate to products manufactured outside the U.S.? To participants. Oh, sorry. Well, so this, is a little challenging to address. So the support for this project does come from the federal government. And so just based on discussions that we've had, it seemed best to try to restrict it to people within the U.S. So anyone residing in the U.S. could submit a sample for testing, and just to prioritize resources for this. as Ellen said, we can analyze 50 samples a month, and we've had more than probably half the month since we started this project. We received more than 50 samples a month, and we've actually had to shut down the website. I think there are a few months we had to shut it down within the first week because we were overwhelmed with responses. So I know there's a lot of interest in this. So just to be more efficient with the use, and because we're using federal funding, we have currently restricted it to participants from the U.S. And so this is something else we'll discuss moving forward as we consider ways to improve and revamp the project.
Okay, a question about how results are shared. Have results been sent back to all participants? And if someone didn't receive results, why would that be?
Yeah, someone's asking about receiving results back. So it generally takes us anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks, depending on what else is going on in the laboratory, to return results. So everyone should definitely have received results from testing of their products. Those results are typically returned via email. People provide an email address. If you have submitted a sample more than 2 months ago and you have not received results, please do contact me or Brian, and we can track those down. But we try to be as speedy as possible in returning results. And if there are some concerns or problems, please do let us know. All right. Are there additional questions? All right. And if anyone needs to email us to ask for the results, you can email our group at the website or the email address foam@duke.edu. That's foam, F-O-A-M, at duke.edu. And either Brian or I will respond to your questions, and we can look up your results for you if you, for some reason, did not receive those.
Okay, maybe we'll do one more question, and then anything we're not able to address, we'll try to get back to folks by email. So there's a question about whether we can analyze furnace filters and or silicone wristbands.
All right, so furnace filters and silicone wristbands. I'll address the first. So furnace filters, so we're talking about typically about air filters that are installed in the home. We have analyzed those before. They do accumulate a large number of particles, and certainly flame retardants are present there. They haven't been used very often in research to understand levels, exposure, links to products, primarily because there's so much variation within a home. You have different sizes of filters, different sizes of the homes, different air exchange rates. So certainly you can analyze flame retardants on those furnace filters, and we've looked at a few before in the past. They're certainly there. It's just, analyzing them and collecting data, it depends on how useful that data would be to answering certain research questions. So we have not utilized those very often in our research, but it is important to know they can be detected there. Now, silicone wristbands, certainly Kim Anderson's group at Oregon State University has demonstrated the utility of using these wristbands as a personal exposure monitor for a variety of different chemicals that can be found in the ambient environment. So it's thought that chemicals in the air would absorb to the wristband, and as you wear your wristband, that wristband goes everywhere that you go, and so it could be a good measure or monitor of your exposure for as long as you wear that wristband. And so we have worked with Kim's group recently to measure exposure to organophosphate flame retardants using silicone wristbands. So in a pilot study of 40 individuals, we did find that levels of organophosphate flame retardants on the wristbands were actually significantly correlated to the levels of the urinary metabolites. We collected urine from participants on 3 different time points over 5 days, while the participants wore those wristbands for 5 days. So the mass of flame retardant on the wristband was correlated to levels of the urinary metabolites in pooled urine samples. So they do seem to have the potential to be a good exposure monitor, and I think there's more research ongoing to understand or validate the use of these wristbands for other types of flame retardants and for other contaminants in general. But it is important to note that the wristbands will not capture exposure from dietary sources. And so, for example, PBDEs are present at very low levels in the food supply. So we do know that some of our exposure comes from food, while some of it probably comes from exposure in the home environment or other microenvironments, your office, even in public transportation. So it captures some exposure, but not all exposure. So that is somewhat of a limitation, but they do seem to hold good promise for future exposure studies. Okay, and with that, it's 1 o'clock. I know we're out of time. I want to thank everyone again for participating in this webinar, and really thank you again to all those participants who submitted samples. That's really been an invaluable data collection for us, and hopefully a valuable data source for others interested in the use of flame retardants in residential furniture. So with that, I'm going to end that, and thank you for my colleagues and I today here. And if you have additional questions, feel free to email us at foam@duke.edu. Thank you.